I bet you never thought you'd see something like this on this channel. Today we're going to have a Mac project. Yes, that's right, it's a Mac Pro. I really can't condone Apple, more about that in a minute. But if you absolutely have to have Apple, or you want to do Apple in the way that gives Apple the least amount of money possible, well hey, I've got the project video for you. Stay tuned, more right after the bump. Well, if you follow this channel, you know that we really don't like Apple. It's Apple the company, not necessarily Apple the hardware products or Apple the other thing, mainly because it's a ripoff. And it's really hard to say, you know, unequivocally. It's really hard to give an absolute blanket statement like Apple hardware is a ripoff. I'm going to back that up really quick. We're going to go to apple.com. We're going to click on the 21.5-inch iMac with Retina 4K. Okay, to go from 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM at the time of this video costs $200. That's insane. Now that is low power DDR3 memory, but $200 for 8 gigabytes of RAM? Really? Really, Apple? Okay, choose your storage drive to go from a 1 terabyte serial ATA drive of 5400 RPM, aka slower than Christmas, to a 512 gigabyte flash storage drive is an additional $500. I'm sorry, this is not 2006. This 2006 flash storage pricing is insane. Have you seen the retail price of 512 gig flash drives? The really good ones are like $250. The middle of the road ones that are sort of discount are more like $150, something like that. Now here's the real kicker. Yes, this is the 21.5-inch iMac. I don't think that the RAM is user serviceable in those. Historically, it has not been. If we look at the 27-inch iMac, let's pick the one that starts at $22.99. To go from 8 gigabytes of RAM to 32 gigabytes of RAM is $600. Do you know how much this costs retail? Okay, the retail price for 4 8 gigabyte sticks of DDR3, to say nothing of the DDR3 that comes in the base configuration at the time of this video, is less than $250. If you were to upgrade the RAM yourself in this and you knew what you were doing, it would cost you $250. Apple wants to charge you $600. That's not a healthy retail margin. That's robbery. So this kind of thing is a lot of the reason why we have a really hard time recommending Apple. It's not just that they're making a profit, it's that it's absolutely insane. It's absolutely scandalous. And so the interesting thing is people that like a Unix-like operating system, people that like where Linux will be in the not too distant future, look at Apple products and say, oh, you know, I can carry around a MacBook or a laptop or whatever. It's a little bit harder to gauge exactly how much of a ripoff is happening with portable devices because there is an R&D component and there is a research component, and you can make the argument that, well, we have to make up the costs. If you look at Apple's bottom line, they're making an insane amount of money, and hey, capitalistic, you know, more power to them. But if you look at the desktops where they're using standard components, at least some standard components, at least the RAM, some of the other stuff can be argued is kind of standard, is not really standard. You can make the argument. But there is no way that on the Apple Store they should charge you $600 for 32 gigabytes of RAM. That is insane. For me personally, that markup is so high that I really can't recommend Apple products. Apple is ripping you off. So that's why I say that. Once again, on the 27-inch iMac, we see 1 terabyte serial ATI drive, this time at 7200 RPM. To go from that to 512 gigs of flash storage is an additional $500. But that's kind of how things have always been with Apple, including the thing behind me. Apple has sort of been a generation or two behind in pretty much everything that they do, at least as far as desktop PCs are concerned. So if we're not talking about iMacs and we're talking about Mac Pros, for example, the machine behind me uses LGA 1366 as its socket, and that was true up through the new, you know, sort of micro trash can sized Mac Pro from 2013. That used a socket 2011 configuration. Now socket 2011 with the X79 chipset on the PC side of the world, that was released on the 14th of November in 2011. And so it took Apple from the 14th of November in 2011 until 2013 to adopt something with socket 2011. Now, as of the making of this video, Intel and the rest of the world have moved on to socket 2011 V3, which supports a higher thermal design power and more core count and that sort of thing on the socket. It's really a minor revision of socket 2011, but the Mac Pro in 2016 is still using the original socket 2011 variant. So effectively, it's sort of a generation behind. If you look at the other major design change for the new sort of micro trash can Mac Pro versus the sort of more behemoth-y Mac Pro behind me is that multiple CPU sockets are no longer a thing. Apple has looked at it and said, oh, well, we can just cram a bunch of cores on a single CPU. We don't really need multiple CPU sockets anymore. We're going to go with a dual GPU configuration because GPUs are where all the compute is happening. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that that's sort of astute of Apple to say, okay, yeah, we're going to move all the compute. The problem is that the software hasn't really caught up. For people that are doing video production and things like that, there is a lot of software out there that will take advantage of GPU computation and use it. But there's also just as much, if not more, legacy software out there that can't or won't take advantage of the GPU for computation. And so you get into a situation where this machine behind me, in the configuration that it's in now, it has two 6-core CPUs, 2.66 gigahertz Xeon X5650. CPUs are what's in there, which is not even the top end for what will go in there. That was just really, really dirt cheap, which we'll talk about more in a minute. The Geekbench score on that, per core, is a little bit slower than the modern sort of Mac Pro 4-core, because the modern Mac Pro 4-core can go up to 3.2 or 3.7 gigahertz or something like that, whereas this thing tops out at 3.2 gigahertz with the turbo boost. It's 2.66 stock. But for the multi-core performance, this thing is almost twice as fast. It's 12 cores versus 4 cores. Yeah, the new Mac Pro is a lot newer CPUs. Those CPUs are much older. But we were able to get there without spending hardly any money. So if you want to use Apple products, I'm just showing you an easy, convenient way that you can use Apple products without actually giving Apple an insane amount of money. Because most of the advances with computers the last few years have not really been around CPU speed. It's really been around peripheral interface speed. These older Macs are still perfectly viable machines, especially if you do a lot of upgrades. Basically, you upgrade everything in the entire system. Video card, RAM, CPU, storage. We're going to upgrade basically everything in the machine behind me. And it will go from being a middle of the road 2009 Mac Pro to something that was sort of at the upper echelons of what Apple was selling in 2012 before the new 2013 Mac Pro came out. But as we'll see, in terms of benchmarking and performance, this thing will actually give the 2013 Mac Pro a run for its money in terms of performance for most things. Now, there are some things that the 2013 Mac Pro will outperform this one for. I mean, it's newer CPU, newer architecture, mainly around disk performance because you get that fancy PCI Express storage, but it's actually possible to use NVMe storage with the Mac behind me. Yes, there's a clever person out there who has made it so that an NVMe storage device like this with the PCI Express by 4 connection can be used in the machine behind me. Now, the gotcha is that this machine behind me is still PCI Express 2.0. It does not have Thunderbolt, those kinds of things. But in terms of performance and being relatively low cost, the configuration that I'm going to show you behind me is about $350 of parts, including the Mac itself. And that's for 12 cores in total, 64 gigabytes of RAM, and a hybrid drive storage, meaning that it's a combined flash and mechanical hard drive. If you can, I'd recommend just getting a flash hard drive, but I did that to save a few bucks, and I wanted to be like, hey, look, I've got a perfectly viable Mac Pro for $350 that application development can be done on and that sort of thing. But you may say, well, what about a hackintosh? It's like, yes, a hackintosh could be a thing. A hackintosh is where you sort of end up in a situation where you're running the Mac operating system on hardware that's not a Mac. Technically, under US law, this is not a legal situation for you to be in. Will anything ever happen with that? No, probably not. Will you ever see us do a video on building a hackintosh? No, probably not. This is about as close as you'll come. You can get Mac OS to run on normal PC hardware because Macs are PCs. They're just sort of cherry-picked by Apple PCs. In terms of the hardware engineering that Apple does, the hardware engineering that Apple does is mainly around the aesthetic. They want to engineer the hardware and the components to really follow their design aesthetic, and functionality is sort of a distant second thing. So the thing behind me is very close to just normal standard PC hardware. Apple's got their own UEFI and that kind of thing. We're just going to do an experiment and see how this turns out and see how viable this machine is. Yes, basically everything in the machine behind me from 2009 is obsolete, but we can basically upgrade everything and be completely fine and not actually have to pay Apple a whole bunch of money to get, Apple hardware. and we can still be within the terms of the Apple Operating System License Agreement and what is legal within US law. If you are going to do this yourself, the first thing that you should know is that this doesn't work for all Macs that look like this. Apple basically stopped supporting Mac Pros that have a system identifier string as Mac Pro 1,1 or 2,1. 3,1, I would not recommend that you buy a Mac Pro 3,1. You can do stuff with the 1,1, 2,1, and 3,1 Mac Pros, but the ones that we're going to focus on are the 4,1 and the 5,1 Mac Pros. Now, the one from 2013 is the Mac Pro 6,1, but the ones that we really want to focus on are the Mac Pro 4,1 and 5,1. Now, those Mac Pros are typically either single CPU or dual CPU. The one behind me is a dual CPU. If you're buying used on Craigslist or whatever, you'll want to pop it open and look at it, because if you have a single CPU Mac Pro, it can't really be upgraded to a dual CPU Mac Pro unless you order another card for the inside of it, another processor card. It's not cost effective if you have to mess with it in that way. The dual processor Mac Pros have 8 RAM slots total. In the configuration behind me, we're running 8 sticks of 8 gigabytes. Buying the RAM off of eBay was about $100 because we're using error correcting server memory. The CPUs, this thing had originally 2.26 4-core CPUs. I have put in it 6-core 2.66 CPUs that can turbo up to 3.2. We have sort of forcibly upgraded the UEFI on it. This is a Mac Pro 4,1 behind me, but the difference between the 4,1 and the 5,1 Mac Pros is largely down to the UEFI, and so you can actually force update the Mac Pro firmware from 4,1 to 5,1, and when you do that, the chassis behind me goes from supporting only 4-core CPUs to supporting both 4-core and 6-core CPUs. Out of the box in 2009, the Mac Pros only supported the Nihilum Intel CPUs, but later, basically a software update and some other really super minor hardware changes let them support Westmere. The reality is that the 6-core CPUs work just fine with a software update on the 4-core hardware. Apple never did that, but you can do it yourself, and you can download the files that you need to do that. To update the firmware from Apple, there's a little utility that you run that will extract what's needed from the files you download from Apple and apply it as a system update. So what do you need to do if you want to do this? If you want to basically put together a pretty reasonable Mac system for less than a Mac Mini costs? Well, I would suggest that you look on Craigslist and university and corporate surplus, and keep an eye out for used Mac equipment like this to come up. You should be able to pick up a used Mac Pro 4,1 or used Mac Pro 5,1. Those are the system identifier strings. If you look at the sticker on the back, for example, you'll see a Mac model number. Just Google it so that you can find out exactly what it is and what you're getting. The A1289 is the model behind me. That's the Mac Pro 4,1. That's the one that originally shipped with 4-core Nihilum, codename Nihilum Intel CPUs. That's the one that we're going to upgrade to Westmere CPUs, which was in the mid-2010 Mac Pro. In order to do that, we have to update the firmware on the Mac Pro. It will go from displaying as a Mac Pro 4,1 to a Mac Pro 5,1, but then you'll get the 6-core CPU support. I would say that once you do these upgrades to this system, that you will probably get another 2 to 3 years of useful lifetime out of the hardware. It's sort of crazy that you've got a computer that was made in 2009 that ends up still being useful in 2019. But part of that is because Apple always runs a generation or two behind, as I mentioned before. And part of that is because there's not really a lot of demand for better performance on the CPU side of things. Now, it could be the case that a whole bunch of new software comes out and it really is going to take advantage of the new GPUs that are in the new Mac Pro. You can upgrade the GPUs in this with new graphics cards. It is limited to PCI Express 2.0. But it is a possibility. Things could change a lot dramatically over the next year or two. But for software development, if you're using Xcode and Safari and this kind of thing, I would expect you to get at least a couple of more years out of even a 2009 or 2010 Mac Pro. Look at it another way. You're basically upgrading this thing to the upper echelons of what you could get in 2012, right before the new Mac Pro. And so we're talking about, in that context, more like a 6 or 7 year lifetime, which is pretty typical. If it was the stock configuration from 2009, then yeah, you're not really going to get as much. The other thing is that if you want something like, say, USB 3.0, you'll have to add that via a PCI Express add-in card. Fortunately, these things have several expansion slots, so you can throw in a graphics card and a USB 3 card and PCI Express storage, and still have a couple of PCI Express slots left over. Alright, so let's say that you're on board to do this. What do you need to know? Well, the first thing is if you're going to replace the CPUs, most of these have delidded CPUs. Yeah, that's right. The 2.26 CPUs in these Mac Pros, they don't have the integrated heat spreader. It's kind of neat. So when you replace the CPUs, you have to be careful about tightening the heat sinks back down. Now, you'll also need a special tool to take the heat sinks off. Not really super special, but you'll need an Allen wrench, kind of like this one. This is a 3mm Allen wrench driver, but it's very long. And the reason is you've got to basically insert this thing all the way through the heatsink in order to unscrew it. Now, when you unscrew the heat sinks, you'll see that there's no actual retention mechanism for the CPUs into the socket. The mechanical pressure of the heatsink pushing down onto the CPU is what presses the CPU into the land grid array that's part of the CPU socket itself. Now, when you replace the CPUs, you're going to have to be very careful tightening the heatsinks back down when you're using CPUs that have an integrated heat spreader, because the heatsinks are going to stick up a little bit farther than they're designed to. So what you need to do is count the number of turns with your tool and make sure that you tighten down each corner the same number of times, and you don't tighten it all the way down. And you just want to be careful not to apply too much torque as you tighten it back down, or you could ruin your CPU socket. There are actually a lot of guides out there on the internet already for doing this. Hopefully I'll remember to link some in the description of the article, or I'm sure that people in the comments will link to some tutorials for actually doing this. Before you actually replace your CPUs though, you're going to want to make sure that you update your firmware. Now, I would recommend not using OS X El Capitan to update your firmware. The reason for that is because it's got new system protection mechanisms in it that seem to cripple your ability to update the firmware. There's a link in the description for a utility that will attempt to download the updated Mac firmware to go from 4.1 to 5.1. But since this utility has been made, Apple moved the location of the firmware file. So what has to happen is you have to download the firmware manually and then open the disk image and then run the utility. When you run the utility will see that the disk image is already open and will use the firmware from the disk image that you've already opened, so it won't try to download it from Apple, which doesn't work if you try to download it from Apple. So you'll get an error that's like error 5570 or something if the utility, the firmware update utility, can't find the firmware at Apple to download. But if you manually download it, it's completely fine. So I would recommend doing this from OS X Yosemite. Just make a USB stick with OS X Yosemite, install it to a scratch hard drive or a temporary hard drive, and then use that to update your firmware from 4.1 to 5.1. Once you've done that, just go into the system utility here, and it's still going to say Mac Pro early 2009. But if you go into the system information utility, you'll see that it says Mac Pro 5.1. I think this also supports faster RAM speeds, going from 1066 to 1333, something like that. So you'll want to make sure that this firmware update installs and applies properly. In order to actually install the firmware update, you run the utility, it does the thing. It gives you this message that says, hey, now you need to shut down. So you shut down the Mac, and then you press and hold the power button. And on mine, I was getting a rapid LED flashing, and then a long tone, and then it updated the firmware, and basically everything was fine. If you happen to find a Mac Pro 5.1, you will not have to go through this in order to update your CPUs. Now, the next thing is acquiring updated CPUs. For this build, I'm using the Intel X5650 socket 1366 Xeon CPUs. Now, the Intel X5650 are a 2.66 gigahertz part, but they can turbo up to 3.06. You may need a third-party utility installed in OS X to check and verify that turbo is working correctly, but for me it seemed to be. And these are 6-core CPUs, and so since I've got 2 CPUs, I'm going to be rocking a total of 12 cores on this thing. Now, at the time of this video, the X5650s were about $100 for a pair on eBay, a little bit more after shipping and that sort of thing, but that's a pretty good deal. If you want to go top end, the top end CPUs that you can get that will work in a Mac Pro like this, the Mac Pro 4.1 or the 5.1, are the X5690s. So it's the same CPU, it's just a higher clock speed. And the clock speed on that is 3.46 out of the box and 3.73 for turbo. This clock speed is on par with what you would get with a modern Mac Pro, and indeed if you look at the Geekbench website, which is a popular benchmarking software on this platform, the X5690, your Geekbench scores for single core is going to be a little less than 3,000, just a hair less than 3,000 for the single core, and about 30,000 or so for the multi-core if you're rocking 2 6-core CPUs, 12 cores in total. This is pretty good. And so if you look at that side by side with the new Mac Pro from 2013, that's got a Xeon E5 1680 clocking in at about 3 gigahertz with 8 cores. If you look at the performance of that on the new modern Mac Pro, The older Mac Pro is a little better in some ways and a little worse than others. Multi-core, of course, is a little better. Single core is a little worse. But in terms of overall application performance, especially if you're rocking older software that's CPU bound or you can't take advantage of the GPUs, then in terms of CPU performance, you're basically there. So that takes care of the CPU upgrades. What about the RAM upgrades? Well, the RAM upgrade is really easy. Error correcting DDR3 8GB sticks. You can get about 8 8GB sticks on eBay, again, for around $100. That's 64 gigabytes of RAM for around $100 used server memory. You know, 64 gigabytes of RAM is nothing to sneeze at, and you would be able to run a lot of virtual machines. I mean, essentially what you're building is a server. You're taking server class components and basically stuffing it into a workstation and using it. You could do this with gaming and other stuff if you really wanted to. You could dual boot into Windows, you know, put a gaming graphics card in there and be able to do that. So you might be asking, what about graphics cards that require PCI Express power? Well, Macs, again, are a little weird. They supply that through connectors on the motherboard, but you have to use a special cable like this one. It's got sort of a small version of the PCI Express connector on the cable, and then at the other end, you've got two connections. So if you're running a graphics card that needs a lot of power, you'd actually have to use two of these cables to power the one card. But if you're using a middle of the road card, then you'll be fine. But again, because this is a Mac and because you're not going to be really gaming all that much on a Mac, it doesn't make sense to put an insane graphics card in here. So for my purposes, I'll probably end up using something like a 7950 R9 270, something like that for this graphics card. And so the power requirements are going to be fairly modest. If you need to pick up a cable like this, of course, you can pick it up on eBay. You know, just search for Mac Pro PCI Express power cable, and it'll be sort of a smaller version of the PCI Express power connector on one end, and then the standard graphics card size on the other. Now, so for this this Mac upgrade, I did actually end up installing a GTX 760. Now, GTX 760 gives me an interesting situation with 4K support. So I will actually be able to run 4K at 60 Hertz. But I have to do some things for the driver. First, I have to download the NVIDIA web version of the driver, and then I have to do some finagling because macOS is like, oh, 4K, 30 Hertz, that's totally a thing. Works a little better with the ATI cards than the NVIDIA cards, or so I've read. But some modern graphics cards, including this GTX 760, have a built-in Mac-compatible BIOS, so I don't have to flash the card or do anything special with it. So for now, GTX 760, alright. If you were going to do this and you wanted a brand new graphics card, I would suggest a GTX 960. I don't think I would put anything like a 970 or a 980 in here. I think that's probably overkill. One other thing you can do with your upgraded Mac Pro is also get a modern Bluetooth 4.1 card. There's a slot in this particular model, it's sort of the bottom front, that you can use to install a combo Wi-Fi Bluetooth adapter. So that covers upgrading the RAM, CPU, and the graphics card. What's left? It's like, well, storage. The bad news about these older Mac Pros is that they're only SATA 2. So if you're going to use a SATA solid-state hard drive and you're going to slam it in there, then it's really not going to perform up to full speed. It's going to top out at around 300 megabytes per second. But you can totally use PCI Express storage. Now, I mentioned before that it is possible to use NVMe storage. It is not possible to use NVMe storage out of the box. You will have to flash yet another custom firmware from some enthusiasts in order to be able to boot NVMe storage like this. But it's totally possible to do that even on these 2009-2010 Mac Pros, which is sort of insane. I mean, it's like NVMe support on X58 chipset. That seems just like lunacy. Well, no, you totally can do it. However, there are other PCI Express storage solutions like the Plextor M.2s. The Plextor M.2s that we use is a UEFI AHCI type of a deal, and you don't have to run custom firmware to use those with your new Franken Mac. Now, if you do want to use those, I would suggest using the PCI slot closest to the graphics card for that. That's a PCI Express by 4 interface, and it is PCI Express 2.0. You'll have a little bit better performance with that. There's also a RAID slot. Sometimes the slot is labeled on the motherboard, and so it'll say, you know, RAID slot. You can run your PCI Express storage card on there, and that will also perform pretty well. But I do think it is interesting that you can run PCI Express based storage if you're going to do this. Now, to keep costs low for what I did, I chose to use a 500 gigabyte hybrid drive. The hybrid drive is a mechanical drive that's got some flash so that it improves the performance. For what I'm going to be using it for, which is mainly Xcode and testing applications and testing this, that, and the other, the hybrid drive is going to work fine. The hybrid drive is also dirt cheap. It was like $50, $60, something like that. So it's a little bit less expensive even than a flash-based storage drive, and for what I'm going to be doing, it's going to be faster than mechanical drive, not quite as fast as a solid-state drive, but okay enough to be able to use on the 2.5-inch interface. Strictly speaking, the case that Apple has is designed for 3.5-inch drives. 2.5-inch drives in mounting this is really problematic because of the way that the screws are, but it's nothing a little electrical tape can't fix. It's also true that I wanted to do this as cheaply as possible. Now, if you're starting from, say, a Mac Pro, actually from 2012, to do these kinds of upgrades, you may not need to upgrade the CPUs. You may end up only upgrading the graphics card and the RAM. You may end up only upgrading maybe the storage. You may end up just putting in a USB 3 adapter as opposed to, some of the other stuff. That's fine. That's all well and good. Now, the great thing about doing this is that you still have, quote unquote, an official Mac Pro. Even though you've basically upgraded everything in the entire system, it's still recognized as an official Mac. Now, Apple does have the ability to do some stuff to sort of kind of tell that you're running a Hackintosh, but there are ways around that. Mostly the problems that you would run into with a Hackintosh are down to using software like FaceTime and that kind of thing. But we've seen where Apple Payments wants to go with the Apple iPhone, and we've seen how Apple wants to sort of lock down hardware. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good idea. I hope that in the not too distant future we will be able to run basically everything under Linux, because Linux is the best operating system in terms of respecting user freedom and that kind of thing. But until we've got more software that is well supported on Linux, and Linux is a more mainstream option, then I like to keep options open and basically just be able to run everything. I run Windows and Linux and Mac OS and pretty much everything under the sun, including a bunch of obscure operating systems. Subtle dig at Mac. Keeping an eye on things in the PC industry. But, what are you going to do? The other thing I'll mention, too, is that Apple has historically sort of penalized people that would do aftermarket upgrades. One really good example is with trim support on SSDs. It was very much the case that if you had an OEM identifier, if you modified your flash drive to report as if it was an Apple flash drive, then you would get trim support enabled. If you had an SSD that was third party, then trim support would not be enabled. And of course, without trim support, the performance of your flash drive will tank once all of the cells have been written to in the flash drive, because it would go and erase the cells sort of on an as-needed basis, as opposed to doing it when the drive is idle. Now, there's a company called Otherworld Computing that historically has supported all kinds of Mac upgrades, and for a relatively modest fee, they'll provide flash drives that report like as if they're Apple flash drives in order to enable trim support. But mechanically, under the hood, there was no real reason for that. Now, I think in modern OS X with El Capitan, they finally enabled it so that, third-party trim support is a thing and is allowed and is working. I have not verified that because I don't really use Macs extensively, but I don't believe that to be an issue anymore. And if it is an issue, there are third-party utilities out there for enabling trim on third-party SSDs. Because I'm using a hybrid drive, I'm not going to really run into that problem. I did experiment with the Plextor M.2 in the Mac Pro behind me enough to make sure that it worked. But I have not experimented with the NVMe, for example, to make sure that trim is working correctly there, or that the controller is operating correctly. So maybe somebody in the comments can let us know the full story on that. But those are the kinds of games that Apple plays, even though this is quote-unquote standard hardware. And so that's another reason, in addition to the outrageous pricing, that makes it difficult for us to, in general, recommend Macs for people. However, this way minimizes the amount of money that you have to give Apple. I mean, yeah, I guess if you're going to be an Apple developer, you still have to pay to join the Apple Developer Program, which, whatever. But at least this way, you're not paying $500 or $600 for 500 gigabytes of flash storage, or $600 for 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is just criminal. But that is just my opinion. Interestingly, on the motherboard labeling on this, I noticed that the PCI Express slots were labeled by 16 by 16 by 4 by 4, though most of the stuff I've read online seems to suggest that only the graphics card slot is by 16 and the other ones are actually by 4. I'm not really sure if that's actually the case, or maybe that was a reference to an older model of Mac Pro or whatever. For this, for my purposes and my needs, this is going to be completely fine. Genuine Apple hardware at a teeny tiny fraction of the genuine Apple price. The other thing that you have to consider is that, Mac Pros from this genre do evoke a certain aesthetic with some people. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that are gutting these things and turning them into PC cases and, upgrading them and otherwise just, doing stuff with their innards, because these cases do breathe really well and they do have a certain aesthetic. They are kind of large and bulky. They're made out of aluminum. They've got some okay features internally, But, you know, this is kind of an iconic computer. And it is nice to be able to get some additional use out of something that's, you know, older. And of course, generally, when you pick one of these up, the more scratch and dent looking it is, the better the price you can negotiate. I like this as a general approach to not give Apple, you know, $600 or $500 or whatever for a 512 gigabyte flash drive, or more than 2.5 times retail for 32 gigabytes of RAM. But, you know, your mileage may vary. You may not care about those kind of things. The other thing with this video that's kind of weird is this is really old news. This is a really popular thing to do in, you know, 2012 or 2013. The parts would have been more expensive then because, you know, like the X5650 was still a really good server CPU. It still is, honestly. The only real improvements have been in dramatically reducing power consumption in terms of like instructions per clock and that kind of thing in modern CPUs. Modern CPUs really aren't a lot faster. In the server arena, they've added more cores and up the clock speed a little bit. So this video is really kind of old news. But, you know, I tweeted about it, and it was something that I was working on internally for another project because we're trying to get ready for the Portland office. So I decided to just do a quickie share with you this particular project build so that you could see it and so you could see what I did. To basically spend as little money as possible, but to still have, you know, officially supported, I guess, Apple hardware and sort of an Apple platform in order to be able to do stuff on the Apple platform, mainly being able to run the Adobe Creative Suite with a reasonable graphics card and a reasonable machine configuration is sort of what I was looking for here. And I think overall it went pretty well. Now I think that there are going to be a lot of people that have a lot of really interesting tips and tricks and tidbits they're going to be posting in the comments. Please do go post over on the forum at teksyndicate.com. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.